Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are doing something a little bit different.
A little bit.
Usually we take a topic, a concept or an event, and we rip it open to see what makes it tick. But today, we were looking at a man who was, well, he was quite literally designed to be a machine.
That's not an exaggeration either.
No, not at all. We're tackling a figure who the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy calls, and I'm quoting here, the most influential English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century.
It's a massive title, but honestly, it might even be an understatement. I mean, if you look at the way modern democracies function, how we think about free speech, how we argue about gender equality, even how we define happiness itself.
It all traces back to this one guy.
It all, in some way, comes back to John Stuart Mill.
But the thing that hooked me, looking through all these sources, isn't just the philosophy, as fascinating as it is, it's the biography. I mean, we're about to unpack the life of a man who was essentially bred in a lab to be a genius.
Bred in a lab is a very colorful way to put it, but it's really not far from the truth at all.
And because of that, he suffers this massive mental breakdown. He falls deeply in love with a married woman and, waits over 20 years for her. And somehow, through all of that, he manages to reconcile cold, hard logic with deep human emotion.
And that tension, that's really the key to understanding him, isn't it? The tension between the rigid, almost brutal logic he was raised on and the messy, complicated human emotion he discovered for himself.
Exactly. So that's our mission today.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand how he navigated that tension. We want to see how his ideas on things like the harm principle, utilitarianism, and the subjection of women became, well, the bedrock for modern liberal democracy.
And we have a huge stack of sources to draw from. It's really a remarkably well-documented life.
It is. We're looking at extensive biographical records, his own autobiography, which, by the way, reads like a psychological thriller in some parts. It's incredible.
It really is. And then, of course, his major works. We're digging into On Liberty, Utilitarianism, the Subjection of Women, and his principles of political economy.
Plus, we have all these historical accounts of his political career, his personal life, his letters. It's a lot.
It's a lot of ground to cover, but it paints a very, very complete picture of an incredibly complex figure.
So let's just jump right into it.
Yeah.
Part 1, the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think we have to frame it that way. This was an experiment.
Absolutely.
And to do that, we have to introduce the architects of this project. His father, James Mill, and his father's best friend, the famous philosopher Jeremy Bentham.
These two are crucial context.
Yeah.
You can't understand John Stuart Mill without understanding them. James Mill was a Scottish philosopher, historian, a very serious, very intense, almost severe man.
And Bentham, of course, was the father of utilitarianism.
Right. They were part of this group called the Philosophic Radicals.
Radicals makes them sound like they were, throwing Molotov cocktails, but they were really just incredibly intense nerds.
Yeah. Intellectual radicals, for sure. They had a very specific, and to them, a very scientific worldview. The core of it was utilitarianism, the idea that actions are right if they produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
The greatest good for the greatest number. We've all heard that.
But they were also very rigid, very analytical. They believed the human mind was a tabula rasa, a blank slate.
So nurture over nature to the absolute extreme.
To the absolute extreme. They genuinely believed that if you controlled all the input, every single piece of information a child received, you could perfectly control the output. You could design a person.
And they decided that young John Stuart Mill was going to be their vessel. He was the test subject.
He was. The goal, their explicit goal, was to create a genius intellect, a successor who could carry on the cause of utilitarianism after they died. So they designed a curriculum to do it.
And when I saw the details of this curriculum in our notes, I actually laughed out loud. It is completely absurd.
It is staggering. It creates a sense of profound inadequacy in anyone who reads it, I think.
Okay, let's just list some of this because you really need to hear it to believe it.
Yeah.
He started learning ancient Greek at age 3.
3 years old.
I was eating dirt at 3. I was learning not to walk into walls.
Right. And this wasn't just, learning the Greek alphabet. This was intensive. By the time he was 8 years old, he had read all of Aesop's fables in the original Greek.
Okay.
Xenophon's Anabasis, the whole of Herodotus.
Herodotus at 8. That's thousands of pages of dense ancient history.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just reading them passively, was he?
No, absolutely not. That wasn't the method. He had to recount everything to his father. Every evening, they would go for a long walk, and John would have to give a full, detailed report of what he had learned that day. His father would correct him, quiz him. It was relentless.
And it wasn't just the humanities. He was doing arithmetic, physics, astronomy, and history alongside all of this.
All at the same time. The notes say that by age 8 he was starting Latin, and by age 10 he was reading Plato and Demosthenes with ease.
In the original Greek.
In the original Greek, I mean, at an age when most kids are reading fairy tales, he's reading Plato's dialogues.
By 12, he's moving on to scholastic logic Aristotle, and then political economy. He's studying Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
And Ricardo is such an interesting figure here. David Ricardo was one of the great classical economists and a close friend of James Mill.
Right.
So sources describe these walking seminars where Ricardo would invite the young boy, remember a 12 or 13-year-old kid, to go for walks with him just to discuss political economy.
Can you just imagine that? You're 13, you're having a casual stroll with one of the most famous economists in history, and you're debating what? The labor theory of value, the law of diminishing returns.
It's mind-boggling. It certainly set him apart. But, and this is the crucial part, there is a huge cost to this.
Of course.
You mentioned he was shielded. His father deliberately kept him away from other children. He didn't have friends his own age. He wasn't allowed to play games. He didn't have play at all, in the way we understand it. His only companions were his father and his younger siblings.
And he wasn't just hanging out with his siblings, he was their teacher. That part is just, it's brutal.
That's a crucial point. It was part of the system. As soon as John learned something, he was immediately tasked with teaching it to the younger children.
So not only did he have the pressure of learning it perfectly himself,
And the pressure of performing for his father on those walks.
he then had the pressure of having to instruct his siblings. It was a high-pressure cooker environment from the second he woke up to the second he went to sleep.
He was a brain in a jar. A very, very well-educated jar, but still. He was built to be a reasoning machine. And for a while, it worked. I mean, the experiment was, in a way, a success. He was a prodigy. He was publishing in academic journals in his late teens. He was editing Bentham's massive, almost unreadable manuscripts.
But then, almost inevitably, the machine broke.
The crash, the great mental crisis of 1826. He was 20 years old.
This part of the autobiography is so raw and so relatable, actually, despite his bizarre upbringing. He's grinding away, he's working for the cause of utilitarianism, promoting reform, and then suddenly he just hits a wall.
He describes it as a dull state of nerves. The joy just drains out of everything.
And he asks himself this one pivotal question. I think this is such a haunting, powerful moment.
It is the turning point of his entire life and his entire philosophy. He asked himself, and you can feel the weight of it when you read it, if all your objects in life were realized, if all the changes in institutions and opinions which you are looking forward to could be completely affected at this very instant, would this be a great joy and happiness to you?
And his heart just sank. The answer was no.
An emphatic no. He says, an irrepressible self-consciousness distinctly answered no.
That is just devastating.
It's the ultimate existential crisis, isn't it? He realized that even if he won, even if he achieved everything he'd been trained his entire life to achieve, if he fixed the world exactly how his dad wanted, he wouldn't feel a thing.
His purpose just evaporated.
It completely dismantled him. He realized that his education had given him these incredible intellectual tools. He could analyze, he could argue, he could deconstruct anything, but it had completely neglected the education of his feelings. He said his habit of analysis had become a perpetual worm at the root of his passions.
He had no emotional connection to the work. He was, as he feared, just a machine.
And he fell into a deep, deep depression. For months, he writes about contemplating suicide. He felt like he had nothing left to live for. But then, slowly, he found a cure. And it wasn't more logic. It wasn't a better argument.
No, it was the last thing his father would have prescribed.
It was poetry, specifically the poetry of William Wordsworth.
Which is so funny because his dad and Bentham, they basically thought poetry was nonsense, right?
They viewed it as misrepresentation. If a
Right.
statement wasn't factually, literally precise, it was basically a form of lying. It served no utility.
But Mill is reading Wordsworth, and he has this epiphany.
He reads these poems about natural beauty, about common human feelings, and he finds himself moved. He realizes that beauty can generate compassion. It can stimulate joy. It wasn't just about calculating utility. It was about feeling something. He realized feelings were the source of all value.
So emotion wasn't a weakness or a bug in the system. It was the fuel. It was the whole point.
Exactly. And that was a massive revolutionary shift for him. It moved him away from that cold, abstract, almost mathematical Benthamite calculation toward a much more human-centric worldview.
And out of this depression, he develops an insight about happiness that I think is just brilliant. He calls it the paradox of hedonism.
It's such a profound observation.
So what is that?
He realized that if you consciously ask yourself, am I happy? You immediately stop being happy. The very act of scrutinizing the feeling makes it disappear.
Because you're analyzing it instead of just feeling it. You're back in your head.
You're back in your head, exactly. So he concluded that happiness is best achieved en passant, in passing. You don't aim for happiness directly.
You sort of sneak up on it.
Yeah, you sneak up on it. You aim for some other object, the improvement of mankind, a creative pursuit, the happiness of others. And then, as he beautifully puts it, you inhale happiness with the air you breathe.
That is such a modern piece of advice. I mean, that's what every therapist will tell you today. Stop chasing the idea of happiness and just go do meaningful things.
It completely saved his life. And this emotional awakening, this new understanding of the inner life, it really set the stage for the next major chapter of his life, which involves the person who would become arguably the most important influence on his work.
Harriet Taylor.
Harriet Taylor.
So part 2, the muse and the partner. It's 1830. Mill is around 24, 25. He's coming out of this crisis. And he meets Harriet Taylor at a dinner party.
And by all accounts, the connection was immediate and electric. She was brilliant, she was passionate, she was radical in her thinking. She was everything he was starting to realize he needed.
And there's just one small problem.
She's married.
Right. Not just married. She has a husband, John Taylor, and children. But Mill and Harriet hit it off immediately. They have this intense intellectual and emotional connection. And thus begins one of the most unusual and, for its time, scandalous relationships in Victorian history.
It lasted for 21 years before they could marry. For 2 decades, they maintained what they called an intimate friendship.
Which sounds like a euphemism, but it probably wasn't.
The general historical consensus, based on their letters and everything we know, is that the relationship was chaste until her husband died. But they were constantly together. They were writing together, talking, traveling together whenever they could. It was a partnership in every way but the physical.
So how did the husband handle this? I mean, in Victorian England, that sounds like a recipe for a duel.
John Taylor seems to have been an incredibly tolerant, if long-suffering man. He was a successful pharmacist, a decent person, but he just wasn't Harriet's intellectual equal, and he seemed to know it.
He accepted that Mill provided a kind of mental and emotional companionship that he couldn't.
It seems so. It was certainly an awkward triangle. They would have dinner together, the 3 of them. It was very strange, but they made it work in their own way for 2 decades.
But we really need to clarify something here, because history, especially older biographies, often writes Harriet off as just the love interest or the muse. But the source material, especially Mill's own writing, suggests she was way, way more than that.
Oh, absolutely. We have to debunk the great man myth here. Mill himself credited her constantly and lavishly. He called her mind a perfect instrument and considered her the most eminently qualified of all the people he knew, including all the famous male thinkers of his day.
He actually said that in many cases he was just the amanuensis, which is basically a fancy word for a secretary writing down her ideas.
He did. He saw their work as a complete collaboration, especially when it came to their most radical ideas on women's rights, on socialism.
So specific works like The Subjection of Women and his most famous book on liberty, which was published shortly after her death.
He said those were joint productions. The socialist chapters of his Principles of Political Economy, he says those were her influence. She pushed him. She took his logical framework and filled it with this human urgency. She consistently made him more radical.
They finally married in 1851, 2 years after her first husband, John Taylor, died of cancer. And this is where we see Mill putting his money where his mouth is when it comes to women's rights. He writes a marriage contract.
Which was an extraordinary thing to do. You have to remember, under Victorian law, when a woman married, she suffered what was called civil death.
Civil death. That's a chilling term.
It is. She essentially became the legal property of her husband. Her entire legal identity was subsumed by his. She couldn't own property in her own name. She couldn't sign contracts. She had no rights over her own children.
So Mill writes this formal private document before they marry, basically saying, I refuse to be a tyrant.
Exactly. He wrote a formal protest against the odious marriage laws. He repudiated all the legal rights the law automatically gave him over her person and her property. He promised her absolute freedom of action, complete equality in the partnership. He refused to be a master in the eyes of the law, even if the law insisted on it.
That is incredible allyship for 1851.
Yeah.
But the story's just so tragic. They finally get to be together after waiting for 20 years.
And she dies only 7 years later.
It's heartbreaking. In 1858, they're traveling through France. She contracts a respiratory illness, likely tuberculosis, and dies suddenly in Avignon.
It completely devastated him. He wrote that the spring of his life was broken. He was absolutely broken.
He bought a house in Avignon, right across the road from the cemetery where she was buried, just so he could be close to her grave.
He did. He furnished it with the furniture from the hotel room where she died. He spent a huge portion of his remaining life there, just writing and looking out the window at her grave.
But in a way, her death spurred him to publish the works they had developed together. On Liberty, which came out in 1859, just a year later, is really a testament to their shared vision.
He dedicated it to her. The dedication is beautiful and heartbreaking. He calls her the inspirer and, in part, the author of all that is best in my writings.
Which brings us perfectly to part 3, the philosophy of freedom. On Liberty is probably his most famous, most enduring work.
It's a short book, but it packs an incredible punch. And it tackles this core, eternal struggle in politics, the struggle between liberty and authority.
And here's the nuance that people often miss. Mill wasn't just worried about the government clamping down on you. He wasn't just worried about a tyrannical king or a corrupt parliament. He was worried about something he thought was much more insidious.
He was worried about social tyranny.
The tyranny of the majority.
Exactly, which feels incredibly relevant in the age of social media, cancel culture, all of that.
So what did he mean by that exactly? How is society a tyrant?
He argued that society can practice a tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression, because it doesn't just punish your body, it enslaves the soul itself.
Wow.
It isn't about formal laws. It's about the crushing pressure to conform. It's about public opinion. It's about ostracization, shaming, the collective weight of what everyone thinks, which can crush an individual's ability to be different.
So even if the law says you're free to do something, if you know that doing it will make you a social outcast, will get you fired from your job, will make your neighbors hate you, you're not really free.
They're not. Your soul is enslaved, as he puts it. And Mill believed that individuality, even eccentricity, was absolutely essential for human progress. If everyone thinks the same, if everyone lives the same, society stagnates. We need the outliers, the nonconformists, the people who are willing to experiment with different ways of living.
So to protect this space for individuality, he establishes the central pillar of the entire book, the harm principle. This is his one simple rule for when society can interfere.
It is a very simple but incredibly powerful rule. The harm principle states that, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others.
To prevent harm to others. Let's break that down because everything hinges on that phrase.
It does.
So can I stop you from doing something because it's bad for you? Like if I see you smoking or making a really bad financial decision.
Absolutely not. That is the crucial anti-paternalism stance. He says your own good, whether it's physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant for interference. You cannot force someone to do something or not do something just because you think it will make them happier or wiser or a better person.
He has that great line, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign.
Precisely. As long as you are not hurting anyone else, society needs to back off. Your life, your choices, your mistakes are your own business.
But what counts as harm? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If my neighbor's lifestyle offends my religious beliefs, is that harm? If you say something that hurts my feelings, is that harm?
Mill would say no to both of those. Offense is not harm. Disgust is not harm. Harm, for Mill, generally involves a direct violation of a distinct and assignable obligation or right. So things like violence, theft, fraud. He sets a very high bar for interference because he believes the cost of suppressing liberty is almost always higher than the cost of allowing someone to make a mistake.
Now, he does carve out a couple of exceptions, which are important. He says this principle doesn't apply to children.
Right. Children need protection. They haven't reached maturity, so paternalism is appropriate there. And this is the controversial one we'll have to come back to.
Yeah.
He says it doesn't apply to backward states of society.
The colonial caveat. Yeah, we will definitely unpack that later. It's a huge asterisk on the whole thing.
It is.
But sticking with the principle for a second, this naturally leads to his defense of free speech. And Mill is an absolute radical here. He doesn't just say, oh, we should tolerate opinions we don't like. He says we need to protect and even encourage the opinions we find abhorrent, even false opinions.
This is one of his most brilliant and enduring arguments. He gives three main reasons why we must never, ever silence an opinion, no matter how wrong we think it is.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the silenced opinion might actually be true.
Right. And to deny that possibility is to assume our own infallibility. If we ban an idea, we are effectively saying, I am God. I am absolutely certain that I am right and this idea is wrong, and there's zero chance I'm mistaken.
And history is just one long story of humanity being wrong about things it was certain about.
Mhm.
We persecuted Galileo for saying the earth moved. We killed Socrates for corrupting the youth. We're very, very often wrong.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second argument?
The second is that even if the silenced opinion is false, it might contain a portion of the truth. He says that popular or received opinions are rarely the whole truth. They're usually just part of it. And we need the opposing erroneous view to supply the rest of the truth.
So the truth is often found somewhere in the collision of two opposing ideas.
Exactly. The full picture emerges from the debate.
All right. And the third argument. This is the one that I find the most mind-bending.
It's the most powerful. He says that even if the received opinion is the whole truth and the dissenting opinion is completely false, we still need that false opinion. We must allow it to be debated vigorously.
But why? Why do we need lies if we already have the truth?
Because truth needs to be challenged to stay alive. If a truth is never debated, never has to defend itself against error, it becomes what Mill calls a dead dogma.
A dead dogma.
We just repeat the words like a parrot without any real understanding of why it's true. The meaning is lost. The conflict with error is what forces us to understand the grounds of our own beliefs. It keeps the truth vital and meaningful.
So the crazy person yelling on the street corner is actually performing a public service by forcing me to articulate why I disagree with him.
In Mill's view, yes, a vital public service. However, and this is crucial, there is a limit. Speech is not absolutely protected, and this is where he gives the famous corn dealer example.
I love this example. It's so wonderfully specific and British.
It is. So Mill says you are perfectly free to write an editorial in a newspaper arguing that corn dealers are starvers of the poor. That's an opinion on economics or social policy. It's protected speech.
Okay, that's fine.
But if you go to the house of a specific corn dealer where an angry, hungry mob has gathered with pitchforks and you wave a placard with those same words on it, that is no longer protected speech.
Because the context has changed everything. It's no longer a contribution to a debate.
It's an instigation to a mischievous act. It's incitement to violence. The connection between the speech and the harm, the riot, is direct and immediate. It's not an argument, it's a weapon.
And that prefigures the clear and present danger legal standard that we use in law today.
It's the direct ancestor of it. It's not about the content of the words themselves, but the context, the manner, and the immediate predictable consequence.
That's a crucial distinction. Okay, so that's liberty. But what is the goal of all this liberty? For Mill, it's still happiness. But he had to update the family business, so to speak. He had to rescue utilitarianism from his mentors.
He did. So, part 4, redefining happiness. The basic foundation of utilitarianism remained the same for him. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they produce the reverse.
And happiness is defined as pleasure and the absence of pain.
Right. But you have to recall that Jeremy Bentham had a very crude, quantitative view of this.
This is the infamous pushpin is as good as poetry line.
Exactly. Pushpin was a simple child's game like tiddlywinks. Bentham's point was that if an activity produces the same quantity of simple pleasure, then it is just as good as any other activity. Playing a dumb game is just as valuable as reading Shakespeare or listening to Mozart if the pleasure units are equal.
And Mill, having had that breakdown and discovered the profound value of Wordsworth's poetry, just couldn't accept that.
He couldn't. It struck him as a doctrine worthy only of swine. So he introduces a revolutionary new concept into utilitarianism, the idea of quality of pleasure.
Some pleasures are just
Right.
better than others.
Inherently better. He argues that there are higher and lower pleasures. The pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments are intrinsically superior to the pleasures of mere physical sensation.
And this leads to my absolute favorite quote of his. It's so wonderfully elitist, but also so true. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
It is a devastating put down, but it's also a profound philosophical stance. He's saying there's a hierarchy of being. It's better to have a complex, developed mind that can appreciate art and truth and justice, even if that mind comes with anxiety and existential dread, than to be a simple, happy animal wallowing in the mud.
But how do you prove that? That's the philosophical challenge, isn't it? How do you prove that poetry is objectively better than pushpin?
Mill proposes what he calls the competent judge test. It's very clever, he says. Ask the people who have experienced both types of pleasure.
Okay, so you find someone who has read Shakespeare and played pushpin.
Exactly. And he argues that any person who is competently acquainted with both will invariably give a marked preference to the higher pleasure. They will prefer the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties.
Even if that higher pleasure comes with more struggle or dissatisfaction?
Even then, he says no intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus, even if they were persuaded that the fool or the ignoramus is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs.
What's about dignity, really?
It is. It saves utilitarianism from being a simple philosophy for hedonists. It transforms it into a philosophy about human flourishing, about aspiring to our higher modes of existence.
Speaking of flourishing, we cannot talk about Mill without diving deep into Part 5. Women's rights. We've mentioned Harriet Taylor's immense influence here, but the work they produced together, The Subjection of Women, was just explosive for its time in 1869.
Absolutely explosive. You have to remember the context. We mentioned he was only the second member of Parliament ever to formally call for women's suffrage, but this book went so much further than just the right to vote.
He attacks the entire legal and social structure of gender relations.
The very first sentence of the book is a declaration of war. He says the principle which regulates the existing social relations between the sexes is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement.
He doesn't pull any punches. He compares the position of married women to that of slaves.
He does, and he's careful to say he's using the term rhetorically in some ways, but also in a very real legal sense. The lack of autonomy, the inability to own property, the lack of rights over one's own body and children. He saw it as the last remnant of the ancient law of the strongest.
And I know the standard argument against this back then, and sometimes even today, was, but it's natural. Women are naturally more nurturing or subservient or naturally better at domestic tasks.
And Mill absolutely destroys that argument. He says we have no idea what female nature is because we have never seen it in a free state. He argues that what society calls nature is actually a completely artificial construct, the result of centuries of forced repression and a total lack of education and opportunity.
He uses that great analogy, right? About the tree.
He does. He says you can't take a tree, grow it in a hothouse, bend it out of shape, and then claim that its stunted form is its natural state. You have to see what it becomes when it's allowed to grow freely in the open air.
So until women have the exact same opportunities, the same education, the same freedoms as men, any talk of their nature is just speculation used to justify oppression.
Precisely. And he also brings in the classic utilitarian economic argument. He says keeping half the human race in a state of subordination is a massive economic inefficiency. We are literally wasting half of the world's available talent. It's a drag on all human progress.
It's just logic and justice, hand in hand. Now, speaking of economics, this brings us to a really surprising part of his thought. Part 6, Economics, Socialism, and the Environment.
His economic views are fascinating because they evolve so much over his life. He starts out as a very conventional, classical free market economist, right? He's the intellectual heir to Adam Smith and his friend David Ricardo.
Laissez-faire capitalism.
Pretty much. But as he gets older, and again, this is almost certainly Harriet Taylor's influence pushing him, he drifts much further to the left toward what we would today call market socialism.
Market socialism. Unpack that term for us.
Well, he didn't want the state to run everything. He was a champion of liberty, so he hated the idea of a top-down command economy. He thought it would kill innovation and freedom.
So not Soviet-style communism. Definitely not that.
No. But he also came to despise the wage system of capitalism. He didn't like the master-servant dynamic, where one person or group owns the capital and everyone else just rents their labor to them for a wage. He saw it as a transitional phase.
So what was the solution? What was the next phase?
Cooperatives. He envisioned a future where the wage system would be gradually abolished and replaced by worker-owned associations.
Oh, democracy in the workplace.
Exactly. The workers in a factory or a farm would collectively own the capital, and they would elect their own managers from among themselves. They would share in the profits.
So you still have competition between these different cooperative firms in the marketplace.
Yes. You preserve the efficiency and innovation of the market, but you end the fundamental class division between capitalists and laborers. Everyone becomes a partner.
That is incredibly progressive, even for today, let alone the mid-19th century.
Yeah.
But the thing that really truly blew my mind in the research notes was his take on economic growth. Because almost every economist, then and now, is obsessed with growth, growth, growth. GDP has to go up forever.
And Mill in 1848 says, stop. This is his concept of the stationary state.
Explain this because it feels so modern.
In his Principles of Political Economy, he argues that unlimited economic growth is not only impossible in the long run, but it's not even desirable. He says he is not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on.
He has this beautiful visual description. He says a world with solitude, with natural beauty, with room to breathe, is better than a world where we've destroyed all of that just to support a larger population and more industry. He doesn't want to live in a crowded, wealthy industrial hive.
He's essentially one of the very first environmental economists. He argues that once a society has achieved a sufficient level of wealth where everyone's basic needs are met and people are comfortable, we should stop trying to get collectively richer and start trying to live better.
Focus on the art of living, not just the accumulation of stuff.
Precisely. He looked forward to a stationary state where population and capital stop growing, allowing for moral, cultural, and spiritual progress to take center stage.
That hits so hard today. I feel like he would look at our 24/7 consumer culture and just shake his head in despair.
He likely would. He saw that endless growth was a recipe for destroying the planet and ultimately our own quality of life.
Okay, but before we completely canonize him as a progressive saint, we have to look at the messy parts, the really difficult parts.
We do.
Part 7, the complexities and contradictions. Because while he's writing these incredible books about liberty and feminism and environmentalism, he also has a day job.
Yes. For 35 years, from the age of 17 until he was in his 50s, John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company.
And he wasn't just a low-level clerk. He rose through the ranks to become the examiner of Indian correspondence. He was a high-ranking colonial administrator.
A key figure in the governance of British India.
So the man who wrote On Liberty was helping to run the British Empire. How on earth did he justify that in his own mind?
This is where we come back to that glaring exception in the harm principle. The caveat that it doesn't apply to barbarous or backward states of society.
Oof, such an ugly phrase. So he just carved out an exception for entire civilizations he didn't think were ready for liberty.
That's exactly what he did. He genuinely believed that representative government and individual liberty only worked for people who were sufficiently improved or educated. For civilizations he viewed as stagnant or in their nonage, like India at the time, he argued that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians.
Provided the end is their improvement.
That was the justification. It was a benevolent despotism. The idea was, we are ruling you for your own good, to modernize you, to educate you, and eventually you will be ready to rule yourselves.
It's the classic paternalistic colonialist argument. And it's a massive blind spot in his philosophy, isn't it? It stands in total contradiction to his principles of individual sovereignty.
It's a profound tension. He genuinely seemed to believe that British rule, administered by enlightened men like himself, was better for India's progress than the alternative. But it's impossible to square with the core ideas of On Liberty.
It's just a reminder that even the most brilliant geniuses are products of their time, with massive cultural blind spots. But then, to complicate the picture even more, you look at his stance on the American Civil War.
And he's absolutely on the right side of history there.
Very much so. When the Civil War broke out, a lot of the British elite, the upper classes, were sympathetic to the South.
They liked the aristocratic vibe of the plantation owners, and more importantly, they wanted the cheap cotton for their textile mills. They tried to frame the war as being about tariffs or states' rights.
And Mill's old friend, the writer Thomas Carlyle, wrote that absolutely awful racist piece, The Negro Question, defending slavery.
And Mill was furious. He wrote a scathing public rebuttal. He argued passionately and correctly that the war was explicitly and solely about slavery. He cut through all the obfuscation and said, "This is a war to preserve and extend slavery, and we must support the North."
He saw the Union victory as a necessary shock to the conscience of the world, something needed to finally wipe out the stain of slavery from the civilized world.
Exactly. So you end up with this deeply complex figure, an anti-slavery imperialist, a feminist who believes in benevolent despotism. It's not simple.
Humans rarely are.
Indeed.
Okay, let's move to part 8, the public life and the saint of rationalism. He eventually leaves the East India Company when the Crown takes it over, and he becomes a member of Parliament. And his campaign strategy was, well, it was bold.
If by bold you mean completely non-existent, it's an amazing story. He was asked to run for the seat of Westminster. He agreed, but only on his own very strict terms.
He refused to campaign in the traditional sense. He refused to canvass for votes.
He refused to spend a single penny of his own money on the election. He even refused to answer questions from voters about his religious beliefs, which were highly unorthodox.
He basically just said, look, here are my books. I've written down everything I believe. Read them. If you agree with my ideas, vote for me. If you don't, then don't.
And he won.
It's wild. You could never do that today.
Never. And once in Parliament, he wasn't a quiet backbencher. He immediately started advocating for all the unpopular causes we've mentioned: women's suffrage, stronger rights for labor unions, radical land reform for the Irish.
He was a genuine radical. But there's one surprise in his political record too, isn't there? His stance on capital punishment.
Yes. The great liberal philosopher who wants to execute criminals, it seems very counterintuitive.
It does. In 1868, there was a debate in Parliament about abolishing the death penalty, and Mill stood up and argued passionately for keeping it.
So what on earth was his logic?
In a word, humanitarianism. Wait, how is executing someone humanitarian?
It was a utilitarian calculation. He argued that for the most aggravated cases of murder, a quick, painless death was actually more humane than the most likely alternative, which was locking a man in a cage for the rest of his natural life and forcing him to do hard labor. He called life imprisonment immuring him in a living tomb.
So he thought the abolitionists, in their attempt to be merciful, were actually proposing a crueler punishment.
Yes, he called the abolitionist sentiment an effeminacy in feeling. He thought the death penalty was actually less suffering in the aggregate and a better deterrent. It's a very cold, logical, utilitarian calculation, even if it feels very jarring to our modern liberal sensibilities.
That is certainly a take.
Wow.
Okay, before we wrap up his life, we have to mention his hobby. Because this guy wasn't just about books and laws and logic. He was an avid botanist.
He absolutely loved plants. It was his lifelong passion and escape. He collected over 1,000 unique specimens. You can actually see his collections in museums today. He saw the logic of botanical classification as a model for how to order legal and social systems.
But it was also his escape, right? His connection to the Wordsworthy inside of his brain.
It was walking in nature, looking for flowers, that connects all the way back to his recovery from that mental crisis. It was his way of touching the real, beautiful world.
And we have to tell the manuscript story, the famous burning manuscript. This is just a legendary, painful anecdote.
It's one of the most horrifying stories in literary history. So his friend, Thomas Carlyle, had just finished writing the only draft of his massive, multi-volume history, The French Revolution. He gave the manuscript to Mill to read and offer comments.
The only copy, no backing.
The only copy. And Mill's maid,
Oh, no.
while cleaning, mistook the huge pile of papers for waste paper, and she used it to light the fire.
Oh my God, the entire book, just gone.
Burnt to ash, years of work. Mill was absolutely mortified. He rushed over to Carlyle's house to tell him what had happened. He was in such a state of distress that Carlyle apparently ended up comforting him.
Mill offered him money as compensation, didn't he?
He offered £200, which was a huge sum of money back then. Carlyle, being a good friend, only accepted £100 just to cover his living expenses while he rewrote it.
And he did rewrite it. That's the amazing part.
He did. He sat down and rewrote the entire thing from memory, though he always said the second version wasn't as spontaneous or as good as the first one that went up in smoke.
We'll never know. What a nightmare. Okay, let's head to the outro. We have covered a life that is just breathtaking in its scope. From learning the Greek alphabet at age 3 to reshaping the debates in the British Parliament.
It's a sweeping intellectual and personal journey.
There is that famous quote that's often attributed to Mill. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing.
A classic quote. And for the record, he did say it in an inaugural address at the University of St. Andrews in 1867. The sentiment wasn't wholly unique to him, but it perfectly encapsulates his view on the importance of active citizenship. You can't just passively have liberty. You have to use it. You have to participate and speak up.
And that's really the legacy, isn't it? Mill is this incredible bridge. He connects the 18th century Enlightenment, the rigid, cold, almost mechanical logic of his father and Bentham, with the modern world. He brings humanity into the equation. He brings in individual rights, emotion, the inner life.
He takes their formula for happiness and says, Wait, it's not just a math equation, it's about flourishing. It's about becoming the best version of yourself.
He challenges us, even today, to do hard things, to tolerate the opinions we hate because they might teach us something, to define our happiness by quality, not just by quantity, and to constantly question whether the things we assume are natural, like gender roles, or the inevitability of our economic systems, are actually just artificial constructs manufactured by our institutions.
He was a skeptic, probably an agnostic, but he was chosen to be the godfather to the great 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell. He was this contradictory, fascinating, deeply brilliant human being.
And his central question, one that runs through all his work, remains as urgent as ever. Are we organizing our society to maximize human freedom and individual development? And if not, why not?
What can we do to change it?
That is thought we will leave you with. Go out, inhale some happiness with the air you breathe, and maybe tolerate a corn dealer or two. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.